Hi, everyone. This is Sherry Lichtenberg. Thank you for joining us. We are today for our NRRI webinar. May I have another number, please, sir? We're going to be talking today about numbering. What numbers do people have? How do we get numbers? And why is it that there is a concern about numbering and running out of numbers? We have a really great group for us today. We have Linda Hymans, who is the Senior Manager for Regulatory Compliance and Pooling from Somos, handling the pooling contract at the FCC. Linda has probably more experience than anybody else in the area of numbering. She started out at the Texas Commission. She's worked at the North American Numbering Plan Administrator, NAPA, and she has been working on the contracts to handle the numbering for a number of years. So we're very lucky to have Linda, who's going to talk to us about what is this whole numbering thing about. We also have Michael Johnson. Michael is a utility analyst at the Maine Public Utility Commission. Michael is working on where are numbers going, and is there a way to protect Maine's area code so that there doesn't need to be a new one. We have Henry Pfeiffer, who is with the numbering manager with Core Telecommunications. Henry is an expert in the way that Cortel provides numbers to the various wholesale users. And we're extremely lucky to have Colin Scott, who is Sales Vice President at Momentum Telecom. And Momentum provides numbers on a wholesale basis to a number of companies that use numbers. So we are very happy to have you all here. We're going to cover two issues today. The first is the question of what is happening with numbers? Why is it that we're beginning to have number exhaust? We're running out of numbers in DC, where I am, and it looks like we're going to need a new area code. What is causing that? How might we correct it? And Linda's going to take us through the details of how numbering works. We also are going to talk about the new suicide hotline number and how that short code is going to require some redoing of the dialing plans in a number of states across the country. We're on for 90 minutes. We will be taking questions, and you submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be monitoring those. We'll ask the questions as we move through this process. So we're very excited to have you, and I am going to turn the program over to Linda Hymans. Linda, welcome. Tell us everything we need to know about numbering. Linda, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry.
You'd think after 8 months, we'd all know how to do this.
I thought I had done that already. Anyway, why don't we just move right into the presentation? Next slide, please. This is just a reminder that the NAPA and the PA are neutral administrators. NAPA and the PA have been a part of SOMOS, which you may know is also the toll-free number administrator, under a separate contract, separate bridge contract with the FCC since January 1st of 2019. And the FCC right now is in the process of combining the NAPA and the PA operations under one permanent contract. So many of the things that you're going to see right now might change slightly in the future, but pretty much it's going to be the same, just maybe a little bit different. Next slide, please. This is what I call this a gee whiz slide. It gives some historical background on the North American numbering plan. I say gee whiz because there's just a lot of stuff, but I find it interesting because I love numbering. You can see here that there was steady growth through 1995 after the area codes were created in the first place. From until 1995, there was really very slow and steady growth. But starting with the 1996 Telecom Act, the numbering world just blew up because the CLECs needed numbers. And at that time, they had to take full CO codes in order to get numbers, which caused area codes to exhaust rapidly. The projected exhaust of the NAMP at that time was 2020, between 2010 and 2020. The first overlays were implemented in the late 1990s. My being in Texas, Dallas and Houston were one of the first. And I think New York also had one of the first as well. In 2000, the FCC ordered number conservation measures, which included nationwide number pooling to slow the exhaust of the NAMP. And the current exhaust date of the NAMP is now 2050.
So Linda, before you go on, can you talk really quickly about what we mean by number exhaust?
Yes, what that means is that an area code is going to run out of available prefixes to assign to carriers. And in a later slide, I'll be talking about how many prefixes are available in an area code so that you can get an idea. But what was happening prior to number conservation was full prefixes were being assigned to carriers. So that was causing premature exhaust. Okay, the last big change was the introduction of the interconnected VoIP providers that are now getting numbers directly from the administrator. That started in 2016. And we can move on to next slide. Slide 4 just provides a brief summary of the interconnected VoIP order. The VoIP providers started obtaining numbers, as I said, in 2016. There are actually, as of today, because there was another one submitted, 109 applications that have been submitted for direct access authorization, and 65 are authorized to obtain numbers. So this just gives you an idea of what's involved with the VoIP providers getting numbers. Next slide. This slide is just a list of the primary types of service providers that we give numbers to. Next slide. On this slide, we're going to start with NAPA responsibilities. And as I said initially, we are separate organizations right now. So NAPA is responsible for CO code assignments. And part of that is receiving assignments for prefixes. What happens is NAPA is actually the one that assigns a CO code when that is necessary. And a CO code is the same as a prefix. They also reclaim resources that are not in place. They assign area codes as well and update the information about assigned resources and keep the industry informed as to the supply. In addition to that, they do area code relief. And when we say relief, we talk about the area code exhausting. Well, we have to provide relief for the exhaust, and that's a new area code. And relief planning starts 36 months prior to the forecasted exhaust date. And it's filed on behalf of the industry with the state regulator for their review. And then upon approval, NAPA initiates the first meeting with the industry to begin the implementation. In addition to that, NAPA also does NRUF processing and reporting, and NRUF is the numbering, resource, and utilization forecasting. Service providers have to do this twice a year. January and August it's usually July is when they actually are submitting them. And NAPA processes those and supplies reports for that. And they also assign other types of numbering resources like the 5XX and the KIC codes. So they do some other things as well. Next slide. This I provided to you so that you could get an idea of the active area code relief projects that are going on right now, and they are in order of planned in service date. So you can see I numbered them so you could see easily that there are 13 of them. And you can see what the status is. The Texas one they just started giving out the 945 new area code in Dallas. They just started that last week. Next slide. The national rollout for pooling began in 2002 and it was completed in 2004. Prior to the national rollout, there were also 27 states that had obtained authority from the FCC to do pooling prior to the actual national rollout. And those were rolled into the national rollout as well. As you can see here, of course, the PA is responsible for the assignment of blocks. In addition to that, we have to make sure that we maintain at least and no more than a 6-month industry inventory in the 16,672 pooling rate centers that there are. We also take care of any changes in the status designation. The status designations are mandatory, optional, and excluded. There are different types of mandatory. There's mandatory or state mandatory. I talked to you about the pooling trials. There's also other states that got designated delegated authority after the national rollout of pooling to add even more pooling areas. So that's why we have a state mandatory designation as well. And then there's single service provider mandatory, meaning that the FCC has said that if there's only one service provider in a rate center, they do not have to pool, even if it's a mandatory rate center, until a second service provider comes in. As you can see here, there's almost 50% of the rate centers are either mandatory or state mandatory. Next slide. The benefits of pooling. Pooling is not customer affecting, and blocks within the same CO codes can be used more efficiently because they can be utilized by multiple carriers. This is why area code exhaust dropped dramatically. In 2001, just another gee whiz fact, there were 23 new area codes assigned, but by 2003, that had dropped to 3. So pooling had a dramatic effect on area code exhaust. And since its inception, pooling has saved approximately 92,000 CO codes from being assigned, which is the equivalent to 115 area codes that have now not been needed. One of the other benefits I'll just point out is that service providers can use what we call contaminated blocks, which means they're slightly used. They have to have 100 numbers or less used in a 1,000 number block, and they can use those blocks, which was not available to service providers prior to the rollout of pooling.
So Linda, just to make sure that folks catch up with all of these great terms. Pooling means that multiple carriers can use that same block.
Right.
And a block has how many phone numbers?
10,000.
And so that is why
Sorry.
we've begun to see we've begun to see sharing. So we have slowed a little bit the running out of codes.
Right. And let me clarify, it's 10,000 in a code and 1,000 in each block. There are 10 blocks in a code. So if you could move on to slide 10, I actually have a little picture of how pooling could work. And I used the 202 area code here as an example. You have one prefix, the 222 prefix, and you can see that service providers B, C, and D are all able to use individual blocks out of that particular code. Then next slide, please. I call this one rules of the road. This is what NAPA and the PA uses to make sure that the rules are met in order for the applications for numbers can be processed. We use FCC rules, we have the FCC contract, and then there's also the industry guidelines, which is the thousands block pooling central office code administration guidelines. Those have been combined in anticipation of the contracts being combined. And then there's LRN assignments, which is local routing number, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the future. And you can download these from the Industry Numbering Committee website if you need them. Next slide. Applying for numbers. This is where I'm going to talk, Sherry, about how there are 800 central office codes actually available in an area code when it first starts out. But out of those, there are only 792 prefixes actually available for assignment. There are some codes that are set aside for other things that cannot be used. Of course, N11 codes cannot be used either. So that's why there's 792 codes available for use. For CO code and block assignments, a service provider has to have a valid NRUF on file, including a forecast for the rate center that they're requesting numbers in. A rate center is something you might call an exchange or an area where your phone is located. That's what a rate center is. Area codes have many rate centers. It is because area codes have many rate centers that exhaust happens as well, because if there's not enough blocks in the pool, you may need to open a central office code to get numbers. And we're going to talk about that in the future. In addition to the NRUF, they have to make sure they're not on the FCC list for delinquent payments, which is called the red light rule. They have to have, for their initial request, they have to have certification or some kind of authorization, either from the state or the FCC. And they have to provide proof of facilities readiness, or that they're going to be able to put these numbers into service. Central office codes that are assigned, they are assigned through the NAPA administration system, and blocks are assigned through the pooling administration system. I did want to mention that VoIP carriers have to provide the same type of documentation. The only difference is that they also have to provide proof of 30-day notification to a state, and also have to show proof that the state received that notification. And the notification is where they're going to be requesting numbering resources, and the type, whether it's going to be needing to open a code or whether they're just going to take blocks. Other carriers don't have to do that. For central office codes, the types of new resources are initial and growth. Initial means it's the first time they've ever entered that rate center. And growth means they already have numbers there. For initial, they have to provide all of that documentation I just talked about. They have to provide, their proof that they're supposed to be able to get numbers there, et cetera. For growth, they have an additional form that they have to fill out for months to exhaust and utilization. What that means is that they have to demonstrate that they're going to, that their existing codes will exhaust within 6 months, and they will also reach 75% utilization in that rate center. This was another number conservation method that was utilized by the FCC. Supporting documentation is required for all those initial requests, as I said. And then in addition to that, the administrators support the service providers when they're requesting numbers, especially the first time when they're just starting out, they've just gotten their authorization. And we have a number of resources on our website, like a new service provider checklist. We have FAQs and user guides, training videos. For VoIP providers, we have a getting started for VoIP providers and a 30-day notification regulatory contact sheet to make it easier for them to submit their 30-day notification. And I did want to mention that service providers are required to maintain no more than a 6-month inventory, and service CO codes and blocks must be placed in service within 6 months after the original effective date. Next slide. Service providers are required to submit forecasts every 6 months to the pooling administrator, in addition to the NRUF that I talked about earlier that they have to also submit. The PA then translates that forecast into an NRUF that we file with NAPA. And the PA also uses these forecasts to determine whether there are enough blocks in each pool. Next slide. As of the end of last year, 90% of the rate centers were in pooling. So there are actually a total of 18,485. I'm sure you all remember, but I put it on this slide anyway, that there are 16,672 rate centers that are in pooling. All but 3 states have mandatory pooling. Those are North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming. They have no mandatory pooling. Because we have to try to maintain an inventory for the service providers in order for them to get numbers, we have to maintain that 6-month inventory. We look at the service provider forecasts. We look at pool replenishment requests, and some of the issues that can impact that is either last minute or incorrect forecasting. A service provider, for instance, can put their forecast in right before they request numbers. So that would not have been included in any forecasted need. Or a depletion of resources already spoken for caused by last minute forecasting. For instance, that carrier comes in, hasn't forecasted, taken a block, and now the person that the carrier that did forecast can't get a block. And then of course there's incorrect forecasting or market surges that can impact this. Next slide. This is a busier slide because it's involving opening central office codes, because that's really what impacts area code exhaust. Full codes are primarily requested for LRNs, dedicated customers, and pool replenishment. A service provider rarely keeps a full code, but requests a certain number of blocks to take from that CO code, and then the remaining blocks are returned to the pool. For an LRN, which again is location routing number, this is needed for pooling and porting. The requesting service provider has to be the code holder, which means they're responsible for the rating and routing of that code. But that service provider is only allowed 1 LRN per LATA and switch or point of interconnection. So they can't have LRNs everywhere and open codes everywhere. a dedicated customer is a request for a full code from one customer, and we need some type of customer letter in order to assign those. Pool replenishment is used when there are not enough available blocks in the pool to meet service provider demand within the next 6 months. The objective of pool replenishment is to maintain a sufficient number of blocks. And the PA, because they are not authorized to get numbers themselves, have to rely on service providers that can meet all of those requirements I talked about earlier in order to be able to open codes and replenish the pool. We manage this process by using the service provider forecasts. But I did want to mention that codes can be opened for pool replenishment even when there's a sufficient number of blocks in the pool to meet that particular service provider's request, if there are not enough blocks in the pool to meet a 6-month forecasted demand. So what I'm saying in this case, is that there could be 11 blocks in the pool, but a forecasted demand for 20. So if this service provider is just coming in for 1 block, even though there's 11 blocks in the pool, they can open a code and they will be prompted in the system that pool replenishment is needed. They can open up a code to replenish that pool based on the forecasted demand. We have a report on our website called the Pool Tracking Report that can be viewed in real time to see what the forecasted demand is and how many blocks are available and how many CO codes are projected to be needed. And once a code is opened, even though blocks are returned to the pool, that NXX is then removed from the inventory of available codes in the area code, and that's what contributes to area code exhaust. So I just also wanted to mention that one of the parts of our annual report every year is to look at forecasted blocks versus actual blocks assigned. And last year, we had the highest percentage in 5 years, but it was still only 45.36% of blocks that were forecasted actually were assigned. And that's all I have. That went quicker than I thought it was going to go.
And Linda, we already have questions. So let me ask a question that has come in through the chat box that I think is probably puzzling a lot of us. Is there going to be a point where we completely run out of numbers, and are we going to have to go to 11-digit dialing? Where is that? Is that part of what is forecasted?
Yes, part of what the NAPA does every year, we not only forecast the exhaust of every individual area code, but we forecast the projected exhaust of the entire North American numbering plan. And right now, that's not projected to be until 2050. So we have a little bit of time, but I mean, the numbers are a finite resource. So at some point, yes, they will run out and we will have to dial more than 10 digits. What the industry comes up with as to how many of those digits it'll be, I don't know.
All right, there are going to be a gabillion more questions about that, but everybody put 2050 on your calendar, and so that you'll have plenty of time to do the reprogramming of all your auto dial. Linda, thank you. And I know we're going to have a lot more questions coming up, and you probably are going to be the recipient of most of them.
Well,
Michael,
I will be here.
Let me switch over to you and ask you to talk about how Maine is handling this whole numbering issue and where we're going to go from here. I think Maine is a good example of why this is an issue.
Yes, that's right. And let me just go ahead and share my screen here. Can everybody see that okay? Okay,
That
great.
looks great to me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Let me just move one thing here. Okay, great. Linda, thank you for having me. Sure, thank you for having me here today. And I'm pleased to be on this panel. So a little bit of background about Maine and our area code. Maine is one of 12 states right now with a single area code. Over the years, the Maine Commission has worked hard to maintain our single area code. In fact, in the early 2000s, our state worked with a coalition of small and large states to initiate 1,000-block pooling to conserve numbers, as Linda was talking about. So in addition to the need for numbers by providers, the 207 area code also has deep economic and cultural connections. In fact, if you were to look at our Maine Secretary of State's website and go to their business directory and search 207 in the business name in their directory, you'd find over 100 businesses that had 207 in their title. On the cultural side, there's a program that airs every night on our NBC affiliate called 207, which deals with cultural issues. When word broke that the 207 area code could be in jeopardy or move towards exhaust, it was amazing how much media attention came about. There were all sorts of articles, but most of the articles were generally really curious about how we were either going to preserve the area code or what would happen next. And this one article in the corner here from WMTW talks about the 207 area code being part of Maine's cultural identity. So why is the demand for numbers so high? Well, from our perspective at the commission, we don't have all the answers on that, but the most basic theory seems to be that there are just more providers now requiring more numbers. And I think Linda also touched on that. Initially, you had the so-called legacy carriers, the ILECs and then the CLECs. You had wireless providers coming in and cable providers offering VoIP products. And then now you're seeing this explosion of VoIP carriers that are requiring more numbering resources. So, Linda touched on a lot of this as far as CO codes, and sometimes they're called NXX codes. But in Maine, this is a good example of what she was talking about. There are about 247 rate centers or exchanges, if you will. And each one of those starts off with a CO code or an NXX code. And then those blocks start to fill up. So there's 10,000 numbers or 10 blocks. And, historically, when you just had the one ILEC, offering the service, it didn't really matter what block you were on. But as time moved on and pooling was introduced, what we've seen is that in some cases, a lot of those blocks are contaminated in an XX code or central office code. So the 10 blocks, you can't use them all. You might have to open up a new code. And then that just kind of repeats itself over and over again. But when we've drilled down at the numbers a little more deeply, what we've noticed in Maine is that while we are slated for exhaust in the fourth quarter of 2024, our actual number utilization, the sort of per number, not 1,000 block, the per number use of the numbers is closer to 39%. So when we look at that, we think there's still a lot more life left in 207. And so that leads us to what we've been doing at the Maine Commission to try to extend the life of the 207 area code. So this past year, we opened up an inquiry and we invited all the providers and who are doing business in Maine to weigh in on some ideas we had. One was consolidating rate centers. This is not a popular thing and it's not done frequently, but we thought, to conserve the issuing of those CO codes, those NXX codes, what if we combine some of those 247 rate centers, shrunk them down maybe to a smaller number, maybe 150. That way the resources of all those rate centers could be shared for future use. Another idea was increasing block contamination levels. Linda touched on that as well. So if you're using more than 10% of a block, it's done. Only that carrier can use it. And so what we suggested was maybe possibly increasing the utilization up to the contamination level up to 25% or even a higher number. And this is not a novel idea. This was done back in the early 2000s in California. They did this in 2 area codes and it was met with some success. A third idea we proposed was a technology-specific overlay. So really that would have focused on companies that are, perhaps VoIP companies or wireless that are consuming a lot of numbers coming into Maine now. And we thought, well, maybe we'll get ahead of the game a little bit and open up a new area code, but have it be just for that specific technology. Finally, another idea was a more tried and true method, which was to return unused and underutilized blocks. So either zero numbers in use on a block or less than 10%. And that's where we kind of gravitated towards. It seemed like the path of least resistance where we could get the most buy-in. So we closed our inquiry and we opened up an investigation. And the idea is not necessarily a novel idea. As you can see here from the screen, this is the federal law. The federal CFR requires providers to return back unused or low contaminated blocks back to the pool. And so, we did that. Providers started notifying us of the blocks they had. They did their inventory search. And what we saw was that there were hundreds of blocks that potentially could be returned back to the pool. In some cases, providers started immediately returning blocks back, and then others maybe sat on them a little bit. So just yesterday, actually, our commission voted to require the providers to actually return those blocks back to the pool. Again, we don't think we're doing any big regulatory overreach here because this is the existing rules that are in place anyways. So the returning of those underutilized numbers, unused numbers will definitely help our area code. We're hopeful that we gain some months in the life of 207, maybe longer, maybe a year or more, but we're still seeing increased demand. And so we think the long game of this for the 207 area code is something called individual telephone number pooling. And this would be the next evolution of pooling, whereby instead of doing pooling at the 1,000 block level, you would do it on an individual number basis. It would be more kind of an on-demand system. So providers would not be prohibited from pulling down 1,000 numbers in a block. Instead, they would just take the numbers they need. And we hear this time and time again from new providers coming into Maine that want to establish a presence in every rate center, all 247 rate centers. But they tell us, they say, well, we only really need a couple dozen numbers. And so it's that, we appreciate them coming into Maine and offering their product. On the other hand, it's a little frustrating that whole block now might be, we might not be able to use that block again. And so the Maine Commission, along with the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission, filed a petition with the FCC New Hampshire started it and we followed back on April 26, 2019 to make this request. And there's been some comments on that filing, but the FCC has not yet ruled on what they may or may not do. And so while this may benefit Maine or New Hampshire or some of the other 10, 11 states out there in our situation, as Linda talked about, there is a concern that the overall pool will go exhaust, up to 2050 in the year 2050. So this sort of becomes a bigger issue beyond just Maine, and how do we conserve the numbers in the pool unless we want to move to some new way of dialing. So we're hopeful the FCC strongly considers this idea, and so we're very hopeful in the future for that. So I think that's all I have, and I'd be happy to take questions later on.
Thank you, Michael. And there are going to be a number of questions here. And I take it the FCC hasn't responded in any real way to the petition, right?
So not as of yet, and I just checked again today just to make sure. But there was a lot of traffic for a little while. The New Hampshire PUC made their filing, then we made our filing, and then a lot of the industry weighed in. Some other states weighed in, but we have not yet heard from the FCC where they would rule on it yet.
And we can probably call this just-in-time number provisioning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically a good way to look at it. It's kind of an on-demand system, and it really would allow for, it would not prohibit carriers or providers from getting the numbers they need. It would just allow them to get the numbers they actually need. And it might allow us to make use of some of the stranded numbering resources we have in many rate centers right now.
So speaking of providers, Colin, let me go to you and ask you, what are you doing with all these numbers?
Besides the obvious, which is calling people and having people call out on them, a lot of, we've said the word VoIP a few hundred times already today. And I think that's the front and center concern when you start to talk about new providers in the space. We're a voice over IP provider. We partner with several providers of telephone numbers, and we use them for various purposes. Like I said, the primary uses will take them to customers and provide numbers to those customers. But a lot of the time, we have other applications that require numbering. Things like someone may want an SMS number that's totally separate and apart from their business line or their cellular number. We have lots of real estate customers, and in many cases, they want all the texts, they want all the emails, they want all the telephone calls. So they'll assign a number and a texting number to that particular customer. So this customer now has a number on their desk, a number on their mobile, a number for texting and SMS, and perhaps even another number for instant messaging. So one person, 4 numbers, as well as the other numbers that are used throughout the business. Likewise, we have customers that have numbers in multiple sites. And a lot of times you'll see a customer who may have a location in Atlanta, which, we're very near to a point of exhaustion with Atlanta area codes. 770, 404, and 678 are already gone. And so now we're on to 470, and I think 943 may be the next one, but there is one coming. So someone may have a business that works throughout Atlanta, may desire to have an NXX that is local to a specific area, whether it's Marietta, Atlanta proper, Decatur, or any of the other major suburbs, and they want to appear as part of that community, appear in those listings, and appear like a local call. It stretches even further when you start to talk about multi-state businesses, and even further still when you start to talk about multinational businesses, where we have customers that have companies or branches of their companies that are in Paris and Turkey and England and New York and London and Los Angeles and all over. And throughout all those places, they've got numbers, sometimes a number in each location from each country that they're represented. Sometimes they've got US-based numbers moving through different facilities to pass through session border controller so that they can actually reach into other countries with that US-based dial. So there's a wide assortment of how those numbers get used, how they're deployed, and how we feel like we use them. And in the same way, we have plans and our own opportunities on how we mitigate exhaustion. And we look at it from the perspective, which is very narrow for purposes of this conversation, but from the perspective of our own inventory and not exhausting our own inventory and putting ourselves in the precarious situation of waiting on inventory to show up or not show up. So we have plans around that. And then lastly, I'll indicate there are some smaller rate centers where we're pushing new service providers to grow. And these smaller areas are, they don't get the same type of attention maybe that Atlanta gets. When Atlanta runs out of its major 3, 678, 770, and 404, didn't take very long for 470 to show up. Now 470 is almost gone, and we're going to run out again. Same thing in places like Dallas. But in smaller areas where it's not the NPA that's exhausted, it's the NXX that is exhausted, those places a lot of times have trouble with number portability. So new numbers have to be brought in as substitutionary in those cases. They also have trouble creating a new NXX within that zone because the demand for it would be so low in some of these more rural regions that there's just not any action that's going to be taken because you either don't lose enough popularity or you don't lose enough votes if you don't do anything. So the bottom line is that we have to be very creative with how those numbers get deployed. And we may have a ton of numbers for Georgia. They may not all live in Georgia, and that might be because Georgia's where we can get inventory.
So let me ask you a question that came in over the Q&A and that you've actually begun to address. There are numbers, US numbers, that we're giving to businesses in Paris. How does that, are we giving them to foreign carriers or to the business itself? Does it have to be a US business? And who watches over all of this?
So those are sort of big questions, and I'm going to try.
I like big questions.
I'm going to try and stay inside our company policy if I can.
Please.
So we have customers that exist in the U.S. that have presences in other areas. So we have a major footwear company that's a customer of Momentum's, and it is known the world over. And has presence the world over, also is manufacturing the world over. But their interest is in the consolidation of their services so that they have a very flat organization from a telecommunications perspective anyway. So we provide numbers, stateside numbers to some of their international locations, but the headquarters is in the US. And for us, by and large, because of the requirements of GDPR, we don't have any customers who are Eurocentric or Asia-centric and exclusively in those regions. So everybody that we have that has a domestic or stateside number, a standard, North American dial plan number, is based in the US. I know that's not the case across the board, but for Momentum, because of how we do things and because of how we deliver our services, some of the legal requirements and the regulatory requirements, but also some of our own best practices and policies dictates that's what we should do. So we don't have anybody that's just in Paris and then also in Nice and then also in Lyon that we're providing service to and giving them US numbers. They may be Paris, Nice, Lyon, and Brooklyn. And in that case, we would be able to supply a number or two overseas.
I hope that this is the major manufacturer that makes all my shoes with the red soles, but we can talk about that offline. Thank you, Colin. I think that was really important. So, Henry, who do you give numbers to?
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Henry Pfeiffer, numbering manager for Cortel Communications. Cortel is an East Coast-based CLEC, and we're also expanding our branch, 180 Communications. Some of the things we are a carrier, so we sell numbers to other voice CLECs, and a lot of the stuff we're seeing is voice over top applications. So I read in ARP that suggested.
Henry,
Hello?
you're breaking up.
Oh,
your hotspot may be misbehaving.
It might be. Is that any better?
That is. Thank you.
Okay. So I was saying we are a carriers. We sell to other VoIPs and CLECs, and a lot of demand we're seeing is for all the voice over top apps that are coming out. We'll give you a phone number to dial out us. So I read an ARP article the other day suggesting you to download either TextNow or Google Call to give you a new DID to call out of, so you wouldn't get spammed back by sharing your caller ID. Also, there's things that drive demand, like everybody that has a connected device or a tablet or a hotspot. Those are all using cell numbers as well. We are seeing some other things, though, which are potential solutions to this number exhaust. So a lot of our customers are less focused on geographic locations where numbers are coming from. They see numbers, and if you have a hotspot, you might not care what number for it came from as well. And that needs to solve some of the problems, like the stranded resources that Michael was talking about. So we could go in and find rates and it might have, a couple thousand docked in there that might not be used, and we go ahead and request those. that'll help out. Oh, so that can help with getting resources in rural areas. Some other solutions that we have looked at are subpooling. So Michael was talking about how carriers might come into Maine and only need a dozen or so numbers in a rate center. So we have considered voluntarily offering a subpooling service to other voice looking to get started. So they can come look at you for $1,000 in their rate center. You know, in our direction, and they just get a dozen or so that they might need to offer their coverage. Solutions for exhaust. I agree with Michael on the rate center consolidation for leaving less numbers stranded out there in the middle of nowhere. I see even having maybe one rate center per state in 10 years, maybe even sooner than that, once we're all shrouding over exchange access. Another idea that's a fun one is Linda mentioned earlier that there are 800 numbers available for every area code that is open, and that is because right now you cannot get 001 through 199 and a couple other ones in there, which goes back to rotary phones. You don't want to dial 0 for operator or go over just 1. So that could open up 2 million per area code and get 20% more overall. Did you guys get all that, or am I still waking up?
You have been breaking up, but I think that we taught, and you know, it was all working. For those of you who don't know, Henry is really in a parking lot and in Alabama talking to us from there. I'm interested, Henry, in this idea that if I have that my iPad has a phone number and a lot of other connected devices have numbers, are we going to be seeing that increasing? And I hadn't thought about the fact that I could get a secret phone number that all my spam calls could go to.
Yes, so I think we're definitely going to see that increasing. So you're if your kids have an iPad that has a data plan, it's going to have the phone number. So your household could have, a dozen phone numbers in it, depending on how many connected devices that you have. And I could get on my phone right now and download, a dozen or so apps and get a dozen or so more phone numbers right now if I wanted to, most of them for free. So the demand is definitely there as these different apps are competing and needing to offer phone numbers just with a click.
So I'd like to go into some of the questions, and I'd like the whole panel to respond. Clearly, this is a really big set of of interest to people. So let's start with this idea of VoIP providers. Colin, you, Henry, you have direct access to numbers. Back in the day, a VoIP provider had to go through another provider to get numbers, and Linda could watch over that and make sure that there weren't any problems. What's happening now? Who is making sure that you all tell the state commissions that you've entered their area and that you're going to provide numbering? And I mean who in the kind of generic word?
Sure. So a lot of that is done.
This?
So a lot of that is done through the 30-day notice that Linda talked about earlier. So for a CLEC to request numbers, you have to file that NRUF form that goes through NAPA, and that assumes you've already gone through the state to get your CLEC certification and operator carrier number, et cetera. Whereas a VoIP provider, you just need one OCN for the entire country. So when you have the 30-day notice, that is when you're looping in the Public Service Commission. So in some cases, you just email it to someone. In other cases, you go online and go through their e-docketing system. So if anyone watching is on that state 30-day notice list, you may have gotten an email from me this year. But that is how they are tied in. And it is essentially the same information. as what would be on an NRUF forecast, but instead of being in a spreadsheet format that the computer can easily read, we have boiled it down to a PDF that you email to someone.
Colin, same process for you?
Yeah, it's very similar. Our range of business is a little bit different. We are an ILEC, a CLEC, direct service provider, and a wholesale provider. So we actually have customers who are getting their number inventory through us and retaining it within our systems, who are actually CLECs filed and properly reporting themselves. Some states require that, some states don't, and typically, we require some form of regulatory relationship independent of us for cases where we're wholesaling. Obviously, as an ILEC, it's a pretty fundamental process for numbering and gathering and things like that. For our wholesale business, it's going to vary from state to state pretty widely, and it's another consideration that we always think of. If we do a merger or an acquisition, if we go out and acquire a company, and in 2019, I think we did 2, and they each had overlap in common states, but they were filed as different. They were differently statused in different states, and were reporting differently, and in some cases, maybe even improperly in different states. So we had to rectify that and create a sort of a flat process for it. But as far as our own numbering, we function as a normal CLEC would, filing for all the states that we're into, 30-day notice where it's applicable, and long form where it's not. So we also have a really excellent regulatory attorney group that helps us make sure that we stay in compliance, because the last thing that we need, that any of us need, is we're out trying to make the business happen, is regulatory intervention because we didn't do things that we were supposed to do. And Linda, if you want to, you can give me an amen on that.
So, Linda, do you want to help us understand how this all gets policed, if you will, to use a term? And you need to unmute, because there are going to be a lot of questions for you.
Yes, you're absolutely right. First of all, I did want to mention that there is a difference between a VoIP provider and an interconnected VoIP provider. Interconnected VoIP providers are the ones that are actually connecting to the PSTN and so forth, and those are the ones that are getting authorization from the FCC. Other types of VoIP providers could be CLECs, they could be, as Colin has been talking about, with Momentum, different types of regulatory bodies. But what we do is every application that comes in, they have to provide the authorization, and that's part of what the administrators do at NAPA and pooling, is to verify that their authorizations are accurate.
And so, Michael, are you seeing that these providers are, when they enter the market, are notifying your commission?
Yes, we're receiving those 30-day notification notices, and I would say I'm not sure if I mentioned that maybe in my earlier draft of my presentation, but in most cases, the VoIP providers, the interconnected VoIP providers coming in, extend a good relationship where they say, we do want to have a presence in every rate center, but doing a review of the inventory, we do see that there are some rate centers that don't have any capacity right now, so we will wait. It's not a rush for us. So we do see there's a lot of goodwill, I think, out there among some of these new providers coming in to help us out, and they don't always have to. They have the right to get those blocks when they need them. So we have found that really working with new providers coming in, building relationships is helpful. On the other hand, we are seeing applications coming in all the time. So when I was talking about the rural rate centers, where the population density in some of these places is really low, so you sometimes scratch your head, like, if there's only within that rate center, there may only be like 1,000 people living there. there could be a whole host of wireless providers, the ILEC, the CLEC, and then now like 3 or 4 VoIP providers. And then you might have 3 NXX codes there, three CO codes. So it sometimes makes you wonder where all the numbers are going in a spot of Maine that doesn't necessarily have a lot of industry, just people living there, So that's the question we sometimes have. But we do work with all the VoIP providers, and we do see these requests coming in all the time, and so that's, it's been a pretty good relationship.
So Linda, here's a question for you. I think we have more questions at this webinar than any webinar we've ever had. So whether everyone's gotten used to how to use the Q&A box, or Linda, you're just really popular. So what's it in the Dakotas and Wyoming? They don't do pooling. Is there a risk from that?
Well, let me clarify. They do pooling. Okay, they just don't have any mandatory pooling. So what they have is what's called optional pooling. And that's where carriers come in and they pool voluntarily. All right. So far, it hasn't been any different than in any other state.
And so you don't see it as a risk?
No.
All right. So this is something I've not understood. Notice I have to put on my glasses because it's complex. Linda, can you explain the NAPA PA's neutrality and where there's sometimes a conflict when balancing the issue, the service providers' requirements and the regulators' requirements and the ADIS guidelines and all the other people that are playing in this complex place?
Well, sure. It may sound like it's complex, but it really isn't terribly complex. We cannot favor any particular industry segment, any, provider, anything. We follow the rules, period. And, we work with the service providers and the states. I particularly, work a lot with the states whenever they have any questions. But we have to make sure that we maintain a neutral status. We do not express opinions. We provide information on rules, laws, etc., that need to be followed, and guidelines. And generally, it's not too much of a problem.
So if the whole team could talk a bit about the stranded number problem, how did we end up with these little areas in Maine with no people, but lots of phone numbers? Colin, I think you were weighing in on that, or would like to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I Michael brought up an interesting point, and I just dropped him a note. But certainly, it's the result of a land grab. And, if we look around at a lot of the, we're a small ILEC, and we're in a place in New York that has gone from this to this and back to this as a result of the proximity of commuting, where the train goes. There's so many factors, and you look at so many places in the world, in particular in the ruralities, where their economy was an agronomy, it was agriculture based. They have places that don't function anymore, whether you're talking about automobile plants in Michigan or mines in Kentucky. And maybe they had a lot larger population at one point in time. And then you've got people who are, I think we've gone, how long have we been on this thing? An hour and 8 minutes, and we haven't really dug in on the bad actors yet, because they're out there. And there are people who find ways to circumvent these regulations, and there are people who find ways to have more than they need and hoard it. And I think that you start to look at people who refuse to port numbers. They essentially live in a captive environment where they claim a rural exemption or some other form of exemption, and they don't allow number porting. And therefore, those numbers don't access the greater pool. They're retained by a company that doesn't use them. So in situations like that, or situations where you've got companies who just have inventory and they don't really know how to get rid of it. They have it. They have ownership of these rate centers and regional areas that they're supposed to be covered. And they don't know how to get rid of it because they don't know how to port numbers. They never have. So there are still people catching up in this industry to the modernization of these numbers and the way that we manage them.
So Henry or Michael, do you want to weigh in on this? What do we do with these hoarders? Michael, are you beginning to police them?
Yeah, so from our end, it's hard for us to know when someone is using blocks, what they're actually using them for. We know if it's a traditional ILEC or CLEC or wireless company, but we start to see these other companies coming in, pulling down large blocks at times and then needing more. And we just don't, it's hard to reconcile in a small rate center with a small population behind it with minimal industry, why they would need so many numbers, and so that's one side of it. The other side is, going back to my earlier example, when the incumbent ILEC was the only game in town and before pooling, there were 10 blocks and a code, and they put numbers on all the blocks. And some of those blocks might have had 50 numbers on them, some of them 200 and so forth. So there are situations where almost all the blocks had numbers put on them. And over time, some of those blocks have been able to be reclaimed, but that's part of our problem, I think, in Maine, is as a holdover from that pre-pooling period where there are a lot of blocks that are stranded on the ILEC side. But then now we're seeing unusual behavior, I guess, and from one perspective of all these blocks being consumed by new entrants at times, and it's just sort of, we don't know why, and so our doors are open for business, and apparently everyone's following the rules. So that's about all we know, about why those numbers are being used.
Michael, may I ask you? I know this is true of many other locations, but with a lot of smaller ILECs, uniquely so in Maine. Are you still having to play hopscotch with the local access? Which area codes, MPAs, and NXXs are considered local to others, and which aren't? In many regions, I know that it's either total island. You've got an MPA and XX that may be owned by the same company and still may not be considered local to the other. And then you've got to sort of hopscotch around and jump from place to place. Traffic calls as local versus not local, despite geography.
Yeah, that has not really been an issue as far as this goes. We haven't really seen those access issues.
So, Henry, you talked about the apps, and people want to hear from you, but you were breaking up a little bit. Those apps, if they're free, they can scale up like crazy. And you also have machine-to-machine communications. Are they using numbers too? Is there some whole new world of numbering that's kind of hiding in the background that we don't understand?
Well, potentially, as people are finding more uses for phone numbers, people are going to come up with all types of things they can make money off of them. And then, carriers are going to try to meet that demand. We are in a coalition against robocalling, or machines calling you, or even another use for numbers is that we touched on earlier is texting. If they don't want to pay for a short code, they might buy a bunch of phone numbers that they can send a number of texts from. I know in the 2 weeks before the election, I probably got a couple hundred text messages from people who somehow knew my name. So I think there are numerous applications and apps and uses for these numbers that we cannot predict all of them.
And so just to make sure I understand, if my refrigerator is going to talk to the grocery store to tell it that it's time to get milk, and would it please send some immediately, does my fridge have a phone number?
Not necessarily. It could do it just through if it's connected to your Wi-Fi. But let's say you have a 4G fridge, or your fridge is going to send a text to the person who's picking up your groceries, then sure, why not?
So I guess that may be the reason that we're beginning to see so much of this. Linda, how does all of this play in to exhaust and protecting against exhaust? And what kind of oversight is there?
Well, the need for numbers in rate centers that we talked about, I know Michael talked a lot about how many rate centers he has in Maine. If there's no blocks in a rate center, then an NXX code has to be opened in order to fulfill whatever need that is. So if carriers are coming into these rate centers that have no blocks, they're going to have to open a code to get blocks. And the more codes that are opened to do that, then the area code moves closer to exhaust. The only policing that you can really do here is if the guidelines are being followed in requesting those numbers. And if the guidelines are being followed, other than a regulator contacting their carrier and saying, do you really need those numbers? Can you kind of hold off doing that right now? Other than that happening and a carrier voluntarily not opening codes, there's really not much else to do.
So as we move forward, what are the solutions? I know that just-in-time numbering, when we start doing that, please be sure that it's my trademark, might be a solution, going to numbers as needed. Where else do we think we can help this problem, or is this just because we're a new technological society, there's a lot more people doing things, and all of us need 15 phone numbers? Who wants to weigh in? All right, I've never seen such a reticent group, so I'm calling on Colin because he just unmuted.
So I think if you really want to stab at the heart of this, Henry, you mentioned that there were mysteriously some people who knew your name when they called you and left you messages from political campaigns. I live in Georgia, so it has not abated for us yet. We're still here in the thick of it, and there's no telling how many numbers I've burned by blocking them as they call into me on my various other numbers. And then you start to think about the implications of some of the other security measures that we've got as we're attacking robo-dialers and even machine to machine. Are you going to still continue to be able to create clean certificates for these numbers that are being abused in that way through the new stir-shaken policies and things like that? Or are you going to fry them and make a number or a piece of useless inventory? So some of it lies there, perhaps. I don't know. And I'm spitballing solutions. Where we live is kind of where the rubber meets the road. So internally, we have a dead number policy where we don't recycle numbers for a certain period of time. And over the course of the past year, we've had to shorten that period of time just to stop ordering and, sort of the woe and flutter of our inventory management being so dramatic. Because we said we want to keep something dead for six months, so that you either get an opportunity to have a customer reorder that same number, resupply those same numbers or blocks of numbers to a wholesale customer, reuse those numbers for the same purpose for an ILEC, or worst case scenario, the number gets recycled and the traffic that you use that used to go to that number doesn't go to that number anymore, or any blocks or prohibitions that are attached to that number have expired. And I think we've all had the experience where someone's called our mobile number and it's been somebody who used to have that number, and you got to say, no, Johnny doesn't live here anymore. So those kinds of things are happening. I think we see those cycles shortening up so that inventory can become more accessible and you don't have so much dead inventory in terms of numbers.
Henry, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think we've discussed some of the solutions even in short term for, taking the exhaust down. So maybe we can push it past 2050. But I also think we're moving into spaces where that geographical thing is a little more irrelevant, or even your number might even be irrelevant. So, if you think when you share your contact, or if someone said, hey, will you text me Sherry's number? They're going to send me a little contact card with your name on it. And I'm just going to click on it. So if that's 11 digits, I think I'll still be able to give you a call and everything can work. So I know that's down the road, but I think there's enough solutions that will be able to get there, and in the short term, I know states like Michael will have to figure out something to conserve 207, which does have, that cultural significance. But I foresee that we're going to lose a little bit of that going forward, because Maine will definitely have a new area code at some point. And I think it's going to, drop the significance on where your number's from. I'm probably less likely to answer a number that calls me that has my area code, because I think somebody's spoofing it anyway.
So, Linda, there was a technical question, and I know you tried to answer it in the chat. Would you explain again the definition of a block, and is a block an NXX, and how many numbers in a block, and how many blocks in an NPA? So we're all speaking the same language.
Sure.
And do it for those of us who are mathematically challenged, okay?
Okay. An NXX code, or a central office code, has 10 1,000 blocks in it. It has a total of 10,000 numbers in it. So say you have the exchange, 235, that has 10,000 numbers in it. That can be broken down into 10 1,000 blocks that can be used by different telecom carriers. There are 792 of the 10,000 number block NXX codes in an area code that are usable. Does that make sense?
All right, I've been counting that on my fingers, but I'm wearing boots, so I'm not going to be able to take off my shoes right now to do more counting, but I think that's really helpful. Let's talk for a minute about this whole issue of 10-digit dialing versus 7-digit dialing. And we've had a lot of questions about how that works as we move to this new suicide hotline. And we have only a few minutes left, so I want to quickly switch over to that.
Sure. Can we, do you want to put my slides up, or, okay,
Look
there
at
we
that. We have such great technical support.
That's awesome. On July 16th of this year, the FCC issued an order that approved the designation of the 988 as an abbreviated dialing code for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And this is all carriers that are involved in this. Now the thing becomes, and I also did want to mention that 988 was also signed into law on October 17th. So it's actually not just an FCC edict now, it's actually a law. The purpose of it, of course, is so that people can dial just the 3-digit short code in order to reach this suicide prevention lifeline. There were other recommendations made by the industry for possibilities to be able to use one of the N11 codes in addition to the purposes that they're already being used for. But the FCC felt that 988 as on its own would be the best thing to do. As a result of that, as you could imagine, 988 is actually an assigned prefix in some states, an assigned NXX code or central office code that people actually have regular telephone numbers that have 988 numbers. If a state has 988 assigned as a telephone number and also has 7-digit local dialing, those area codes have to change over to 10-digit local dialing to prevent problems with reaching the lifeline once the deadline goes into effect for the 988 code as an abbreviated code. On here, I list the 37 states and territories that are affected by this and the 83 area codes. One of them I wanted to point out was Alaska, for instance, but you'll notice that Maine is not on here. Maine somehow got away with not having to do 10-digit dialing. But there are many states on here and many area codes on here where the exhaust date is well out into the future. The projected exhaust date is well out into the future. And so the impact is substantial for people that weren't expecting to have to dial 10 digits for many, many years, but now will have to do that for all of their local calls. And I know a lot of people will say to me, well, I thought everybody dialed 10 digits, but we don't. And there are a lot of areas that don't. So this is a massive project to not only on the part of the industry to actually transition 83 area codes over to 10-digit local dialing, but to educate the consumers that they're going to have to do this. If we can move to the next slide. Some of the major parts of this project are customer education. Service providers are going to be doing bill inserts, much like they would do with an area code. And NAPA is going to be sending letters to associations like telecom associations and payphone associations, to payphone providers and alarm companies and elevator associations and 911 providers. We've got to make sure they are all aware of this. You'd be amazed. I'm just going to point out to you a situation that's happening in Florida right now. There are 2 area codes in Florida where the alarm companies, they're doing area code relief and moving to 10-digit dialing in 2 area codes with overlays. And the alarm companies have asked for an extension because they have not been able to make all the adjustments and changes that need to be made for the alarm panels. So, you know, there are definitely issues that have to be addressed here. On the technical side, you saw that we have 13 area code relief projects happening right now. This is essentially half of an area code relief project because most of the area code relief projects now involve overlays. We have not had a split option where you split a state in half and each side maintains 7-digit dialing, but one side gets a new area code. We have not had one of those since 2007. So the major impact of an overlay, aside from getting a new area code, is 10-digit local dialing. So this is essentially like doing 83 overlay projects at one time. And so needless to say, there's, you know, it's a massive project and we're trying to get it all done. But the major impact, like I said, is 10-digit local dialing. You have states like Montana and Alaska. Those are 1 area code states that have been doing everything they can to try and save numbers so they can save their area codes. And now they're going to 10-digit dialing anyway. Also, I just wanted to mention, I have here there was a change to the industry guidelines that any state now that implements 10-digit dialing as a result of 988, the only option for area code relief that's going to be available in those states is an overlay as a result of this project. So from now on, any state that's going to be involved in this 988 project, if their area code nears exhaust, the only option they're going to get from the industry is an overlay.
Okay, so the good news out of all of this is that this is going to begin on my birthday, April 24th, just in case any of you want to send flowers. We'll send you the contact card. We have a lot more questions in the question pool, but we've come up against our timeline, and we will be posting Linda's slides and Michael's slides on the NRRI website. I know that we sent out Michael's slides earlier, but because I'm not good at slides, Linda's didn't get sent earlier. And I know you all want them, particularly the list of the states that are going to have to deal with this change. I very much want to thank our wonderful panel who's made numbering, which is really complicated, and I have always, wanted to understand much more enjoyable and understandable. I want to thank our audience and just let you all know that our next webinar will be on December 16. That's a Wednesday. Our normal Wednesday schedule. And we will be talking about low-income solar projects. That is, solar is no longer just for folks with big mansions and lots of room for solar panels. So again, please join me in thanking our audience. We had well over 100 people, and 96 of you are still hanging in. So thank you very much. We look forward. Please let us know what you want to hear about in the telecom space and all of the other spaces that utility commissions are interested in, so that we can put together programs that support you. And just a quick note, the Regulatory Training Initiative training courses will be back in January, and we will be doing a course on utility accounting and on utility finance. So all of you, stay safe, stay happy, stay inside. And thank you again, panel. We will talk to you all later. Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining us.